You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Is 5.5 over-under disrespectful? I would say that it's motivation for sure. It's definitely bulletin board material for Syracuse football that they can use, that they're being doubted by the folks in the desert. But I do not think that this is a disrespectful total. And I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below your thoughts on Syracuse football's over-under 5.5 wins in 2025. I have no problem calling out predictions about whatever it is related to Syracuse sports that I feel are disrespectful. I mean, if you recall, it was last April when we had CF Budge on the podcast when he was trying to defend his ranking of Kyle McCord being the 11th best quarterback in the ACC in the preseason, and that Fran Brown was the 14th most impactful coach in the conference. And we all know that CF Budge ended up turning out wrong, and I called him out for that in the preseason. But in regards to 5.5 wins, I understand it, despite the fact that it's a little low. I would take the over. However, that's just my opinion on that. I'd actually argue that FanDuel is putting a little bit of respect on Fran Brown and this coaching staff. Because when you take everything into account, we're going to talk about it all here on this podcast, the schedule, the quarterback play, the fact that it's really inexperienced, the youth on the roster for this upcoming season. Think of it this way. If Dino Babers was the head coach of Syracuse football right now, what do you think Syracuse football's over-under would be for 2025? What do you think? We're just chatting here. We're just spitballing. 3.5 wins, maybe 4.5 wins. I actually think FanDuel is placing a decent amount of respect on this coaching staff. The fact that they have it at 5.5 and basically a coin flip to be a bowl team in 2025. But let's get to one of the reasons why 5.5 is low, but it's appropriate. Let's talk about the schedule. Syracuse football is set to face 4 teams that made the college football playoff in 2024. They got Tennessee, neutral site in Atlanta to open up the regular season. Now, that's going to be a fun one. That's a fun way to start the regular season, right? You also got at Clemson, who won the conference last year. You got at SMU, the regular season conference champion. And at Notre Dame, the team that, I don't know, they only went to the national title game and lost to a better team in Ohio State, but they're still pretty darn good. And on top of those games, if you look at their road opponents, they also have to go to Miami and to Georgia Tech, 2 teams that are also supposed to be pretty good as well in 2025. What makes it really hard is that those games I just mentioned are all away from the dome. Right? There's no dome field advantage. There's no home field advantage. You're either playing a neutral site in Atlanta against Tennessee, or you're playing a true road game. That makes it tougher for Syracuse football to win those games. And I want to credit Noon's Magician for this fact that I'm about to give you guys, okay? All of Syracuse's road or neutral site opponents in 2025 have a projected win total between 7.5 and 10.5 regular season wins. The quote-unquote worst opponent, right? Again, air quotes for worst, is Georgia Tech at 7.5. And the quote-unquote best, again, air quotes, is Notre Dame at 10.5 wins. The good news for Syracuse football and their schedule is that their home ACC games are a little less challenging, at least on paper. It's Duke, Pitt, UNC on Halloween, and Boston College. All of those teams have an over-under of less than 6.5, or I should say less than or equal to 6.5 wins in 2025. What are the other home games, you may ask? Well, one of them is against Colgate. That's your free win right there. And the other one is UConn. You should be able to beat UConn, but I also would like to point out that UConn actually had its best regular season since 2010 a year ago. They went 8-4, and in 2010, they also went 8-4. So if they can build off last season's success, I wouldn't say that UConn is a cupcake game necessarily for Syracuse football. It's definitely one of the easier ones on paper, but I wouldn't say it's a slam dunk, no doubt win like it used to be when you were facing the UConn Huskies back when they were a 1 or 2 win team for many years. But they seem to be a little bit better with Jim Mora at the helm. And they actually went to the Dome last year, and Syracuse football controlled that game from start to finish. I don't believe that the final score is a good indicator of how much Syracuse dominated UConn, but it was a one-possession game. That's fact. It was a one-possession game when UConn went to Syracuse. Having said that, UConn, Colgate as home, out-of-conference games, it's really difficult to get much easier than that, at least on paper. And then the ACC home games, again, are Duke, Pitt, UNC, and Boston College. So there is definitely an avenue where Syracuse doesn't win a single road game, but they still managed to go 6-6, which would be enough to make a bowl.